Week 31. Last week was actually quite productive. I did manage to implement the 4 different layers of the clean architecture. In addition to that, I also managed to put in the consist tests that would enforce clean architecture adherence as I'm developing this app. The idea being that with the combination of the consist tests, the KT-lint tests, as well as the detect tests, I can prevent myself from making the same sort of shortcut mistakes that I made during my first attempt of the app development. And as I mentioned in my last update, I have the pre-commit, and the pre-push hooks set up. In other words, every time when I commit, the tests would fire, and I would not be able to commit if the tests fail. Every time I want to attempt to push, all tests are run, and a coverage report is generated, and I have to hit a particular coverage percentage. In addition to that, build verification is done also at the pre-push moment. What I currently don't have is platform-specific tests. In other words, if I want to run, not just build, but also run the app in an emulator and check to make sure that there's no runtime issues and what, I don't have that yet. I think I'll probably put that in when I have my MVP, but at this point, I don't want to have to worry about that. Maybe it'll come back and bite me in the future, but I think the amount of effort that I have to put into setting up instrumentation tests like these would probably be not quite worth it. Cinnamon, what are you doing? In addition to the pre-commit and pre-push hooks, I also have my CICD platform, which currently I'm using GitHub. It's amazing. The free tier gives you 2,000 minutes of GitHub runtime on 2 core machines. Anyways, I'm using GitHub CICD platform, and I run all those tests again just to make sure that there's no funny situation going on in my local environment where I might have skipped a test, or I typed in a command with no verify parameter. Anyway, so clean architecture is in, and the app is ready for proper development. And as I'm moving past clean architecture, I was trying to implement the... That's very rude. I'm trying to implement the very first screen, which is the splash loading screen as well as the login screen. This required a bit more than just clean to be in place. I needed to put in the Koin dependency injection, which was already partly in place when I was putting in the clean architecture infrastructure, but it's not fully there yet. In addition to that, I also needed a navigation library, which I'm currently using Voyager. I know Jetpack Compose just released a new, I think the Compose multi-platform now has a new navigation library. Isn't that amazing? Like, up until this moment, there's no official navigation library support. You had to go to get a third-party one. Voyager, I think Voyager? Yeah, Voyager is the most popular one at the moment. I understand that the official one is coming out, but it's still in alpha stage, and the discussions and all the developer feedback and whatnot surrounding it has not been very mature yet. So I'm going to stick with Voyager. So Voyager needs to be in place in addition to Koin dependency injection. On top of that, I also need to implement the state management system. In my last go, I did my own state management. I used an MVI pattern, model view intent pattern, but I did it manually. But this time I understand that there's a library I could have just used. Orbit MVI, I intend to put that in. And so the focus for next week is ensuring that Koin dependency injection is in place correctly, ensuring that Orbit MVI is in place and functions correctly. And lastly, I need to make sure that the Voyager navigation library is actually in place and working fine. In addition to that, I also need to make sure that all the tests related to those need to be in place. In other words, the tests that I have in place need to enforce proper Koin DI pattern. In other words, you shouldn't be just putting in like view model in your constructor, for instance. You have to inject it. Orbit MVI, making sure that we're using the proper notation syntax, best practice and stuff like that. So all these tests need to be in as well. So that's the focus for next week. And if I can get those done in time, I might start putting in the very first function that interfaces with the backend, Superbase backend. That actually would be a much bigger undertaking because, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about that next week. One of the challenges with regards to Superbase backend is testing it is a lot more difficult than other components in the app. The Superbase backend, the official development kit that you can use in Kotlin multi-platform projects, they're not very keen on being mocked. So as you're aware, when you're trying to do a test, you mock certain values in certain classes or certain variables such that you can test the functions of some root functions and classes, right? And Superbase, a lot of Superbase functions that you can use from the library are actually inline functions, and they resist mocking. You can't mock them very easily. So apparently the consensus to test Superbase backend in the KMP project, the Kotlin multi-platform project, is to use integration test. In other words, you, instead of mocking values, you actually summon the entire chain of command and then test against a real mock backend. For that to work, either you'd have to have an environment spin up in, for instance, GitHub Actions, or you test it locally in your Docker container. Now, fortunately, Superbase does have a very convenient Superbase CLI command line tool that you can easily spin up Superbase instances. That's the benefit of an open source project, right? Instances locally on your computer, so you can run tests against them. The problem with this is, of course, the instance itself won't have any value. So if you want to test against your current project, the database needs to be initialized, right? And to be able to, the users need to be in place for you to test the login procedures, and the users from the Superbase CLI command, from the containers generated by the Superbase CLI command line, it wouldn't have that. So you're going to have to feed the users, and that means coming up with a conditioning script. That's a lot of effort. So that likely will be next weekend's goal. So the next week is still being mostly focused on the local UI interface, user interface. In other words, again, the basics: navigation library, state management library, and dependency injection library. 3 things, and all of the tests associated with them. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week.